Imagine giving birth in the dead of winter when temperatures outside plunge to -30 degrees Celsius, when your home has no windows, no insulation beyond packed earth and grass, when the only heat source is a smoky fire that barely keeps adults warm, and when there are no doctors, no antibiotics, no incubators, no modern medicine of any kind. Now imagine that fragile newborn, barely hours old, weighing perhaps 3 kilograms, unable to regulate its own body temperature, completely helpless, has to survive months of frozen darkness in these conditions. This was the reality for every Viking baby born during winter. And here's what shocks historians: these newborns didn't just occasionally survive. They survived at rates that rival and sometimes exceed infant survival in medieval cities with far more resources. Viking settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and the frozen reaches of Scandinavia maintained stable populations for centuries, which means their babies were making it through that critical first winter in conditions that should have killed them. Before we reveal exactly how Vikings kept newborn infants alive through Arctic winters without heat or medicine, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of ancient survival knowledge fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about infant care, medieval life, and what the human body can actually endure. The secret wasn't luck. It wasn't genetic superiority or divine intervention. It was a complete system of knowledge refined over generations where every technique, every material choice, every cultural practice was designed specifically to keep the most vulnerable members of the community alive when everything outside was frozen solid. Vikings understood things about newborn thermal regulation, nutrition, and immune system development that modern medicine is only now beginning to rediscover. And when you understand what they actually did, you realize these weren't primitive people desperately clinging to survival. They were sophisticated practitioners of infant care who had solved problems that killed babies by the thousands in wealthier, more advanced, medieval societies across Europe. The first challenge was immediate and brutal: the moment of birth itself. A newborn emerges from the warmth of the womb at 37 degrees Celsius into an environment that, even inside a Viking longhouse during winter, might be only 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. For an adult, that's uncomfortable. For a newborn with immature thermoregulation systems, it's potentially deadly. Modern hospitals maintain delivery rooms at 25 to 28 degrees Celsius specifically to prevent newborn hypothermia during those critical first minutes. Vikings had no such luxury. Their longhouses, even with the central hearth burning, had significant temperature variation. Near the fire, it might be tolerably warm. Further away, near the walls, it could be barely above freezing. So how did Viking midwives prevent that catastrophic heat loss in the first moments of life? The answer reveals sophisticated understanding of physiology that wouldn't be formally documented in medical texts for another 1,000 years. The moment a baby was born, before the umbilical cord was even cut, the midwife did something that seems simple but was actually critical. She placed the infant directly on the mother's bare chest and immediately covered both with heavy furs and woolen blankets. This wasn't affection or bonding ritual, though it served those purposes too. This was emergency thermal management. The mother's body, still generating enormous heat from the exertion of labor, became an external heat source for the baby. Skin-to-skin contact allowed direct heat transfer, while the covering of furs trapped that warmth and prevented it from dissipating into the cold air. Modern medicine calls this kangaroo care and recognizes it as one of the most effective methods for stabilizing newborn body temperature, especially in premature or low birth weight infants. Vikings practiced it as standard procedure a millennium before Western medicine validated the technique. But they went further. The midwife would heat stones by the fire, wrap them in multiple layers of wool to prevent burns, and place them around the mother and baby, creating a warm microenvironment even if the rest of the longhouse was freezing. These heated stones provided hours of radiant warmth while the baby's own thermoregulation systems slowly activated. The umbilical cord wasn't cut immediately. Vikings waited, sometimes for several minutes, allowing all the blood in the cord and placenta to transfer into the baby's body. This provided extra blood volume, extra oxygen carrying capacity, extra resources that would help the newborn survive the transition. Modern research has validated this practice too, showing that delayed cord clamping improves outcomes especially in challenging conditions. When the cord was finally cut, it was done with a blade that had been heated in the fire, which both cauterized the wound and sterilized the cutting edge. The Vikings didn't understand germ theory, but they understood through experience that hot metal caused less infection than cold metal. The severed cord was tied with a thread made from sinew or wool that had been boiled, again reducing infection risk. These small details accumulated into a system that dramatically reduced the mortality that killed countless newborns in other medieval societies. But surviving the first hour was only the beginning. The real challenge was surviving the first night, then the first week, then the brutal months of winter when temperatures stayed below freezing and darkness dominated. The sleeping arrangements for a newborn Viking infant reveal another layer of sophisticated thermal management. The baby didn't sleep in a separate cradle or crib positioned away from adults. That would have been a death sentence. Instead, Vikings practiced what anthropologists call co-sleeping, but with specific techniques that maximized warmth while minimizing risks. The mother slept on one of the raised wooden benches that lined the longhouse walls, elevated above the coldest floor-level air. The baby slept directly against her body, usually positioned between the mother's breasts where body heat was concentrated and where the baby's face remained clear of bedding that could obstruct breathing. Both were wrapped together in layers of wool and fur, creating what was essentially a shared thermal envelope. The mother's metabolic heat kept the baby warm. The baby's presence against the mother's chest stimulated continued milk production. The arrangement was symbiotic. But Vikings added another element that modern parents might find shocking. Often the father or another family member slept on the other side of the baby, creating a sandwich where the infant was surrounded by adult body heat on both sides. In the coldest months, when temperatures in the longhouse dropped dangerously low at night, this three-person sleeping arrangement could mean the difference between a baby maintaining body temperature or sliding into hypothermia. The raised bench itself was critical. Cold air sinks, so the floor level of a Viking longhouse was always the coldest zone. By sleeping elevated, the family positioned themselves in warmer air layers. The difference might only be 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, but for a newborn, that could be everything. Beneath the sleeping family, more heated stones wrapped in wool provided additional warmth from below. These stones, heated at the central hearth before bed and positioned under the platform, would radiate heat upward for 6 to 8 hours, maintaining a warm sleeping zone even as the main fire died down overnight. The bedding materials themselves mattered enormously. Vikings used specific layers in specific order based on understanding how different materials managed heat and moisture. The bottom layer, against the wooden platform, was usually stuffed with straw or dried heather. This created an insulating cushion with thousands of tiny air pockets that prevented cold from conducting upward from the wood. On top of this came animal skins, fur side down. The leather side created a moisture barrier while the fur added insulation. Reindeer hide was particularly prized for infant bedding because reindeer fur has hollow hairs that trap air exceptionally well, creating insulation similar to modern synthetic materials. The next layer was woolen blankets, multiple layers of dense fabric that trapped warm air while allowing moisture from breathing and sweating to pass through. Wool's ability to insulate even when damp was critical in the humid interior of a smoke-filled longhouse. The outer layer was often sealskin or another water-resistant fur that prevented moisture from the smoky air from penetrating down into the wool layers and reducing their insulation value. This multi-layer system created a sleeping environment that could maintain comfortable temperature for a newborn even when the longhouse interior dropped near freezing. Each material served a specific purpose in the thermal management system. But warmth alone wasn't enough. A newborn needs nutrition, and this presented another seemingly impossible challenge. How to keep a baby fed when the mother's nutrition was limited, when there were no formula alternatives, when winter scarcity meant everyone in the household was surviving on stored food with minimal fresh resources. Viking mothers nursed their babies, obviously, but the way they managed infant feeding reveals understanding of lactation and infant nutrition that was remarkably sophisticated. First, Viking culture supported extended breastfeeding. Babies nursed for 2, sometimes 3 years, far longer than was common in many other medieval societies. This wasn't sentiment. It was survival strategy. Breast milk provided complete nutrition, required no preparation or heating, was always available at the right temperature, and contained antibodies that protected infants from infection in an environment where disease could spread rapidly through crowded longhouses. But maintaining milk production during winter scarcity required the mother to be adequately fed, and this is where Viking's social structure became critical for infant survival. Nursing mothers received priority access to the best food available. This wasn't generosity, it was practical necessity. A malnourished mother produced insufficient milk, which meant a starving baby, which meant population decline. Pregnant and nursing women got extra portions of fatty fish, preserved meat, butter, cheese, and the precious stores of summer-dried berries that provided crucial vitamins. The entire household understood that feeding the mother was feeding the future. The composition of Viking winter diet also mattered. High-fat foods, especially fish oils and animal fats, are rich in omega-3 fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins that transfer into breast milk and support infant brain development and immune function. Vikings didn't know the biochemistry, but they knew through generations of observation that mothers who ate well produced healthier babies. When breast milk alone wasn't sufficient, Vikings had backup feeding methods that seemed crude but were actually carefully developed. If a mother died in childbirth or couldn't produce enough milk, the baby would be nursed by another woman in the household who was lactating. Wet nursing was common and accepted, creating a network of nutritional security for infants. If no wet nurse was available, Vikings prepared a supplement using what they had: warm water mixed with small amounts of butter or animal fat, sometimes with a tiny bit of honey if available. This wasn't ideal nutrition, but it kept babies alive until better options became available. The feeding itself was done with the baby held upright against the caregiver's chest, which prevented choking and aspiration. Babies were nursed frequently, sometimes every hour or two, which matched the natural cluster feeding pattern that stimulates milk production and provides consistent nutrition and warmth. Now here's something that shocks modern sensibilities but was absolutely critical for survival. Viking babies were rarely bathed during winter. This seems unhygienic by contemporary standards, but it was actually sophisticated infection control and thermal management. Water in a Viking longhouse during winter was precious and always cold unless specifically heated at the fire. Fully bathing a newborn meant exposing the baby's entire body to air while wet, which would cause dangerous heat loss. Even after drying, the evaporation of residual moisture from skin would continue pulling heat away from the baby's body. Instead of bathing, Viking caregivers practiced what modern medicine would call spot cleaning. They would warm a small cloth by the fire, wring it nearly dry, and gently clean the baby's face, hands, and diaper area without exposing the whole body to cold or moisture. The baby remained wrapped in wool most of the time. Wool has natural antibacterial properties due to lanolin, the waxy coating that sheep produce. This lanolin helped prevent skin infections even without frequent washing. Diapering itself reveals more practical genius. Vikings used soft, absorbent materials like moss, wool scraps, or soft leather positioned to catch waste. These materials were changed frequently and could be cleaned by scraping off solids and then exposing them to smoke from a fire, which had antibacterial effects and helped dry the materials for reuse. The constant smoke in the longhouse, while irritating to adult lungs, actually served protective functions for infants. Smoke contains compounds that inhibit bacterial and fungal growth. The smoky environment, combined with the dry conditions created by the fire's heat, prevented many of the damp-related infections that killed babies in wetter, less smoky medieval dwellings. Vikings also understood something crucial about infant immune system development. Exposure builds resistance. Babies weren't kept in sterile isolation. They were part of the communal living space, exposed to the household's normal bacteria and environmental conditions. This exposure, combined with antibodies from breast milk, helped develop robust immune systems. But perhaps the most critical element of newborn survival was something less tangible than thermal management or nutrition. It was the cultural knowledge system that every Viking woman learned from childhood about infant care. Young girls in Viking society grew up surrounded by babies. In the communal longhouse environment, they observed births, helped care for infants, learned the techniques and timing and judgment required to keep babies alive. By the time a woman gave birth to her first child, she'd already seen dozens of births and participated in infant care countless times. This knowledge transmission was oral, practical, and continuous. The community's accumulated wisdom about what worked and what failed was passed down through generations of experience. Techniques that saved lives were remembered and taught. Methods that led to infant death were discarded. Grandmothers, aunts, and older women in the household served as repositories of this knowledge. When a woman went into labor, she was surrounded by experienced female relatives who'd successfully raised children through multiple winters. This support network provided not just emotional comfort but practical expertise that dramatically improved outcomes. The midwives who attended births weren't formally trained in medical schools because such institutions didn't exist. But they had something potentially more valuable: decades of hands-on experience, detailed knowledge of what worked in their specific environment, and understanding of the subtle signs that indicated whether a baby was thriving or struggling. These midwives knew that a baby who nursed vigorously and urinated frequently was getting adequate nutrition. They knew that certain breathing patterns indicated respiratory distress. They knew how a healthy newborn should feel, should smell, should behave. This observational knowledge, refined over generations, was remarkably effective at identifying and sometimes addressing problems before they became fatal. The clothing and wrapping techniques Vikings used for newborns weren't random traditions passed down without thought. Every layer, every material choice, every method of securing fabric represented accumulated knowledge about keeping tiny bodies warm in conditions that would kill an inadequately protected infant within hours. The first layer against a baby's skin was always soft, well-worn linen or very fine wool that had been washed and handled so many times it had lost any scratchiness. New, coarse fabric could irritate delicate newborn skin and create tiny abrasions that became infection routes. Vikings understood that the innermost layer had to be gentle, absorbent, and capable of wicking moisture away from the skin. This base layer was usually a simple long tunic that covered the baby from neck to feet, with long sleeves that extended past the hands. The extra fabric at the extremities could be folded back to cover fingers and toes, which lose heat rapidly due to their high surface area relative to volume. Over this came the critical insulation layer, and here Vikings made choices that modern textile science has validated as nearly optimal. They used wool, but not just any wool. They specifically preferred wool from sheep that grew in the coldest regions, because these animals produced fleece with finer, denser fibers that trapped more air per unit of fabric thickness. The wool garments for babies were knitted or woven to be slightly loose rather than tight. Tight clothing compresses the fibers and reduces the air pockets that provide insulation. Loose wool maintains its loft, creating thousands of tiny air spaces that prevent heat transfer while still allowing moisture vapor to escape so the baby doesn't become damp from perspiration. Vikings often used multiple thin wool layers rather than one thick layer, because the air gaps between separate layers provided additional insulation. A baby might wear 2 or 3 wool tunics of progressively larger sizes, each creating its own thermal barrier. The outer layer was typically a small version of adult cloaks, made from the densest, most tightly woven wool available, often treated with lanolin or fat to make it water-resistant. This outer shell protected the insulating layers beneath from moisture in the smoky, humid longhouse air, and provided wind resistance during the brief times when a baby might be carried outside. But the true genius of Viking infant clothing was the wrapping technique they used over all these layers. Babies were swaddled, wrapped snugly in long strips of wool or linen that secured the arms and legs and created what was essentially a fabric cocoon. This swaddling served multiple purposes that Vikings understood intuitively. First, it prevented the baby from kicking off the carefully arranged layers of clothing and blankets during sleep, which would expose skin to cold air. Newborns have reflexive movements they can't control, and an unwrapped baby would inevitably disarrange its own coverings. Second, the snug wrapping created compression that held all the fabric layers in close contact with the body, eliminating air gaps where cold could penetrate while maintaining the tiny insulating air pockets within the fabric itself. Third, swaddling restricted movement, which reduced the baby's metabolic energy expenditure. A baby who couldn't flail arms and legs used less energy and therefore generated less demand for nutrition while still maintaining core body temperature. In conditions of scarcity, this energy conservation could be critical. The swaddling strips were wrapped in specific patterns that experienced caregivers knew by heart. The wrapping was snug around the torso and limbs but left the hip joints with slight flexibility to prevent hip dysplasia, a condition Vikings had observed could result from too tight wrapping. The face was always left exposed for breathing, and the wrapping around the neck was never tight enough to restrict airflow. When a baby needed to nurse, the wrapping could be loosened quickly at the chest without exposing the entire body to cold air. When changing the moss or wool diaper material, only the lower wrapping needed to be unwound. This minimized the duration of cold exposure during necessary care activities. At night, the swaddled baby was placed in the thermal envelope created by adult bodies and multiple fur coverings, creating a sleeping environment that could maintain temperatures of 20 to 25 degrees Celsius even when the longhouse interior dropped to near freezing. But even with perfect thermal management and adequate nutrition, babies sometimes got sick, and here Vikings employed remedies that seem like folk medicine but often had genuine therapeutic value. When a baby developed congestion or breathing difficulties, common in the smoky longhouse environment, Viking healers used steam inhalation. They would heat water at the fire, add herbs like thyme or pine needles that contained natural expectorants and antimicrobials, and create a small steam tent by draping cloth over the mother holding the baby near the rising vapors. This loosened mucus and eased breathing without requiring the baby to ingest any medicines. For skin irritations or diaper rash, they applied rendered animal fat, often mixed with beeswax and sometimes herbs like calendula or chamomile that grew wild in summer and were preserved for winter use. These salves created moisture barriers that protected irritated skin while the herbal components reduced inflammation. Modern medicine still uses similar barrier creams, just with petroleum-based ingredients instead of animal fats. When babies showed signs of digestive distress, cramping, or colic, nursing mothers would drink teas made from fennel, dill, or caraway, knowing that compounds from these herbs would transfer into breast milk and help soothe the baby's digestive system. This wasn't superstition. These herbs contain compounds that modern research has confirmed have antispasmodic effects on intestinal smooth muscle. For fever, which could be deadly in a newborn, Vikings used careful temperature management rather than medications they didn't have. A feverish baby would be unwrapped partially to allow heat to dissipate, but not so much as to cause shivering, which would raise temperature further. Cool, damp cloths were applied to the forehead and neck. The baby was encouraged to nurse frequently for hydration. These methods align with modern pediatric fever management. Vikings also recognized that some plant materials had infection-fighting properties. Honey, when available, was sometimes applied to umbilical stumps or minor wounds because they observed it prevented infections. Modern science knows honey contains hydrogen peroxide and other compounds with antibacterial effects. Willow bark tea, given in tiny amounts to nursing mothers, would transfer salicylic acid compounds into breast milk, providing mild pain relief and anti-inflammatory effects for babies with discomfort. This is the same active ingredient in aspirin, though Vikings obviously didn't know the chemistry. But Vikings were also pragmatic about the limits of their remedies. They understood that some babies, despite all efforts, wouldn't survive. Premature infants, babies born with severe defects, twins when food was scarce, babies who failed to thrive for unknown reasons, sometimes death was inevitable. The cultural response to infant mortality reveals another survival strategy. Viking society didn't invest enormous resources trying to save babies who showed signs they wouldn't survive. This seems harsh by modern standards, but in a subsistence economy where resources were absolutely limited, directing scarce food and care toward infants who had better survival chances ensured more babies overall would make it to adulthood. A baby who refused to nurse, who couldn't maintain body temperature even with maximum warming efforts, who showed signs of severe illness that the community recognized as typically fatal, that baby might receive comfort but not heroic intervention. The mother's milk and the family's resources would be preserved for current healthy children and future pregnancies. This wasn't cruelty. It was tragic calculation made by people who understood that trying to save one doomed infant could result in losing 2 or 3 other children who would have survived with adequate resources. When a baby did die, which happened despite all efforts in perhaps 15 to 20% of births, Viking society had rituals that helped parents cope while also preparing them to try again. The dead infant was buried, often in a small grave near the family dwelling, sometimes with tiny grave goods. The mother was supported through her grief but also encouraged to conceive again as soon as her body had recovered. The community understanding was that child loss, while sorrowful, was part of life in a harsh environment. Women who had lost babies weren't shamed or isolated. They were comforted by other women who'd experienced the same losses, and they were valued for their potential to bear future children who might survive. This acceptance of infant mortality as a reality rather than a personal failure probably helped Viking women maintain the psychological resilience needed to keep trying, to keep bearing children despite the risk and pain and potential loss. But for the babies who did survive those critical first months, who made it through their first winter and into spring, the survival strategies shifted. As babies grew stronger, gained weight, developed better thermoregulation, and began eating supplemental foods beyond just breast milk, they became progressively more resilient. By 6 months, a baby who'd survived winter was much hardier. By 1 year, much more so. By 2 years, Viking children had survival rates that began approaching those of adults. The first winter was the critical gauntlet, the test that determined whether a new Viking would join the community or be lost to the harsh realities of northern life. The babies who survived weren't just lucky. They were the products of a complete system refined over centuries, a system that integrated thermal management, nutritional support, infection control, communal knowledge, and cultural practices all aimed at one goal: keeping the next generation alive long enough to become the adults who would continue Viking society. When you compare Viking infant survival to other medieval societies, the results are striking. In medieval cities across Europe, infant mortality often exceeded 30 to 40%. In some urban areas during plague years or harsh winters, it approached 50%. Half the babies born would die before their first birthday. Viking settlements, despite their harsher climate and more limited resources, appear to have maintained infant mortality rates closer to 15 to 25% based on archaeological analysis of burial sites and skeletal remains. This is still tragically high by modern standards, where infant mortality in developed nations is below 1%, but it was remarkably good for the medieval period. Why did Vikings do better than wealthier, more advanced societies? The answer comes down to several factors that their survival system got right. First, the practice of extended breastfeeding provided superior nutrition and immune protection compared to the early weaning common in medieval cities, where babies were often fed contaminated animal milk or grain porridge that caused digestive issues and malnutrition. Second, the communal living arrangement meant babies were never left alone. There was always someone watching, someone who could respond if a baby stopped breathing or showed signs of distress. In medieval urban households where babies might be left in cradles while parents worked, this supervision didn't exist. Third, the constant exposure to smoke, while irritating, created an environment hostile to many bacteria and fungi that thrived in damper medieval dwellings. Viking babies had fewer respiratory and skin infections despite living in what we'd consider unhygienic conditions. Fourth, the multi-generational knowledge transfer meant Viking mothers had genuine expertise by the time they had their own babies. Medieval urban women, especially first-time mothers, often lacked this accumulated practical knowledge. Fifth, the cultural prioritization of pregnant and nursing mothers meant they received adequate nutrition even during scarcity. In many medieval societies, women ate last and least, which meant malnourished mothers producing inadequate milk. Finally, the acceptance of co-sleeping and constant physical contact meant Viking babies received thermal regulation support, feeding on demand, and emotional bonding that supported both physical and psychological development. The Viking approach to infant care was, paradoxically, more aligned with what modern pediatrics and evolutionary biology recognize as optimal than the practices of supposedly more civilized medieval societies. Vikings were accidentally following what we now call evolutionary parenting, or attachment parenting, because those were the methods that worked in their environment. Modern hospitals are actually relearning some of these practices. Skin-to-skin contact immediately after birth is now standard protocol. Delayed cord clamping is recommended. Rooming in where babies stay with mothers rather than in nurseries is encouraged. Extended breastfeeding is promoted. These aren't new discoveries, they're rediscoveries of what worked for Vikings and other traditional societies for millennia. The Viking infant survival system worked because it recognized a fundamental truth. Newborn humans are designed to be carried, held, kept warm by body contact, fed on demand, and surrounded by caregivers. The attempts by later, civilized societies to separate babies, to schedule feeding, to prioritize independence, these innovations actually worked against infant survival. Vikings, living close to the edge of survival, couldn't afford those luxuries. They had to do what actually kept babies alive, and what kept babies alive turned out to be continuous physical contact, warmth from bodies and materials, breast milk, and communal care. The winter that killed so many in medieval Europe, the season that seemed designed to prevent human survival in northern latitudes, was survivable for Viking newborns not because Vikings were tougher or different, but because they developed a complete system that addressed every challenge a newborn faced. That system wasn't written down in medical texts. It wasn't taught in universities that didn't exist in Viking territories. It was passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, refined through observation of what worked and what failed, tested every winter when babies either survived or died based on whether the system was followed correctly. The knowledge was practical, specific, and devastatingly effective. A Viking woman learning infant care wasn't memorizing abstract theories. She was learning exactly how tightly to wrap the swaddling, exactly which herbs helped which ailments, exactly how to position a baby for nursing in a way that maximized warmth transfer, exactly how to judge whether a baby was thriving or failing. This was survival knowledge in its purest form, knowledge that meant the difference between population growth and population collapse, between thriving settlements and abandoned ruins. And the babies who survived that first winter, who made it through the months of darkness and cold and scarcity, grew up to become the Vikings who explored, raided, traded, and settled across medieval Europe and beyond. Every Viking warrior, every explorer, every settler who reached Iceland or Greenland or briefly North America had survived that first winter as a helpless newborn in conditions that should have killed them. Their survival wasn't miraculous. It was the result of a system, a body of knowledge, a set of practices that worked because they had to work, because the alternative was extinction. Modern parents living in heated homes with unlimited resources and access to medical care can learn from this. Not to recreate Viking conditions, obviously, but to understand that some of the primitive practices we've dismissed actually align with human infant biology better than many modern interventions. The constant holding, the co-sleeping, the extended nursing, the community support, the acceptance that babies need warmth and contact and frequent feeding, these aren't backwards traditions. They're evolved solutions to real biological needs. Viking newborns survived their first winter without heat or medicine because Vikings understood, through generations of hard experience, what babies actually needed to survive. They provided exactly that. Nothing more because they had nothing more, but nothing less because less would mean death. The system worked. The babies lived. The population thrived in one of Earth's harshest environments. And the knowledge that made it possible, mostly unwritten and nearly lost, deserves to be remembered and understood because it reveals something profound about human resilience, adaptive knowledge, and what it actually takes to keep the most vulnerable among us alive when everything outside is frozen and hostile. That's how Viking newborns survived their first winter. Not through toughness or luck or magic, but through a complete, carefully developed system of care that addressed every challenge and provided exactly what those fragile new lives needed to make it through to spring.